So please welcome Bobby Ghosh.
Thank you. I've been a journalist for 33 years, and I've had the good fortune of traveling around the world as a journalist and having a front row seat in some historical world-changing moments. And this year, 2018, is an anniversary for two of those moments. Exactly 15 years ago this month, I was a correspondent in Baghdad for Time magazine, and I was witness to America's greatest foreign policy disaster, the war in Iraq. And then 5 years later, I got transferred to New York just in time to be present for another low moment in American history, which is the economic crisis, the financial crisis of 2008. Now, these were not random events. For a lot of people in the world, these events were milestones in America's road to perdition. There was a feeling in the world that this was the beginning of the end of the American era, that American influence in the world was, from that moment onwards, from 2003 onwards, doomed to keep shrinking, and America's hegemony was coming to an end. Just like all the great empires before, the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Islamic Empire, the British Empire, that the age of the American Empire was coming to a close. And then when I traveled around the world after these events, the prospect of American decline is greeted in different ways in different parts of the world. In some parts of the world, it's greeted with great enthusiasm, with celebration. People in some parts of the world want to see the end of the American era. In other parts of the world, in some parts of Western Europe, shall we say, in some quarters, it is greeted with a certain sense of schadenfreude, that there is a certain satisfaction at seeing the proud, arrogant power being forced down on its knees. But in large parts of the world, this is greeted with great anguish, great fear. And perhaps most surprising to me, the greatest anxiety is felt in America. Many, many Americans feel that their dominant role in the world is now coming to a close. And who can blame them? Because after all, that is the signal they are getting from their own leaders. You had 8 years of President Obama, who behaved as if America's dominance in the world was over. He talked about leading from behind. He didn't feel he could stand up to Putin in Ukraine or a tin pot dictator like Bashar Assad in Syria. And then now you have his successor who openly says that America is in decline. He says the world doesn't respect us anymore, the world is pushing us around. Of course, the reason he says that is because it allows him to set up his promise of making America great again. But of course, to make that claim, you have to start by saying America is not great anymore. And a lot of Americans feel that. Now, how do I feel about it? I am tempted to quote one of America's greatest ever writers, Mark Twain. While he was still alive, a New York newspaper by mistake published an obituary of Mark Twain. And he was asked about it, and because he was a man with a sense of humor, he said famously, "Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." Well, today I'm here to make three contentions. First, reports of America's demise are greatly exaggerated. Second, that the report of China's rise are greatly exaggerated. And third, that the virtues of having a multipolar world order are greatly exaggerated. Let me explain those last two. The idea is that it's not just a question of the decline of America that people talk about, it's what is going to replace America. And a lot of serious scholars, historians, political scientists, imagine two possible scenarios. One is a return to a bipolar world order, except that the role of the Soviet Union will be taken by China. As China rises, as everybody knows, 10 years from today, China's economy will be equal in size to the American economy. That China will take up that role. and China's rise will be accompanied by America's fall. At some point, they will be equal, and then the balance will tilt. Another scenario is that instead of having a bipolar world order, there'll be a multipolar world order. So there'll be many co-equal great powers. So China, Russia, the European Union, the United States, possibly India, and then right below that, another sort of strata of powers like Japan, like Brazil, like South Africa, Iran, possibly Saudi Arabia. And these two scenarios are often offered as positive things. That this is good. It is good for the world to have a balance to American hegemony, whether that balance is achieved by one superpower like China, or whether that balance is much more widely spread, that the world is better served if there are many great powers that are equal and therefore can speak to each other as equals and can put their heads together, put their resources together, and solve the problems of the world. Well, let me start with that idea first, the notion of a multipolar world. Now, if this multipolar world that we are fantasizing about, if all the poles, if all the great powers in this multipolar fantasy were liberal democracies that were committed to the notion of a liberal global economy, that would be one thing. I might be able to welcome that. I have my doubts, but I might be able to welcome that. But even the wildest fantasies of a multipolar world don't imagine that. We have to imagine a multipolar world in which China and Russia will continue to remain autocracies, authoritarian regimes that are ruled by, frankly, individuals. Putin in Russia, and of course, Xi Jinping has just essentially appointed himself emperor for life in China. That world is hard to imagine. So we're talking about going from a schoolyard where you had one bully to a schoolyard where you have multiple bullies. That does not make for a better schoolyard. There are examples in history where there was such a balance of multiple countries, the multiple world powers. And those examples do not allow for any optimism. This country, Italy, has often been the victim of having a multipolar world order. We were talking about, Anna and I were talking about this yesterday, that in the 19th century, Europe was basically the scene of this sort of a balance. You had Britain, you had Germany, you had Russia, you had Austria, and you had France, and they were more or less co-equal in the European sphere. But the way they behaved, they did not get together to solve the world's problems. They didn't even get together to solve European problems. They didn't even agree on what the problems were. They could not agree. And keep in mind, we're talking about 5 powers that come from the same cultural space, 5 powers in which quite often the rulers of these different empires were related to each other by blood, and had a lot of common history together, but they still couldn't actually put their heads together to solve any problems. And usually they circled each other very warily. They spent far, far too much money on building up their defensive systems so that they could, they were imagining a scenario where they would have to compete with one or more of the others. They were constantly ganging up together. The Russians and the Austrians, the French and the Brits, the French and the Germans, they were constantly ganging up together against the others. And when there was a genuine uprising of liberal sentiment in Europe, in Italy in 1848, the year it was called the springtime of the peoples, or the sort of pre-Arab Spring, European Spring, if you like. These 5 powers got together and squashed it like a bug, because the one thing they could all agree on was that these liberal democratic ideas threatened all of them, threatened all of their aristocracies. The next spell in which there was more or less balance in the world was after the First World War, when most of the European powers were in various stages of rebuilding. America, after World War I, withdrew into itself. It went through the Great Depression and didn't feel like it could exert itself on world affairs, didn't want to be involved in world affairs. And again, you had supposedly an equilibrium. But what came out of that equilibrium? Fascism, again, starting in this country. And the forces of democracy, which had made a great stride in the beginning of the 20th century, went into a huge step back in the years between the two wars. So I submit to you that a multipolar world is not the solution to the world's problems, and that a multipolar world in which you have a disagreement among the different poles on what even constitutes the basis of legitimacy. What form of government is legitimate and what form of government, equally important, is not legitimate. If the great world orders can't agree on something as basic as that, the more likely outcome, instead of harmony and peace in the world, is that you will have a race to create spheres of influence. China will want to exert itself in Asia, where it will come into a clash with India. Russia will continue to want to expand its sphere of influence in Europe, and they're not that far from Italy right now. And it'll find itself being able to influence countries that are democratic, as we've seen quite recently. Russia's very keen to influence democratic elections everywhere. And so I'm not sure that this is necessarily a good thing. You'll also see enormous expenditures in defense budgets. Europe has had the luxury of not having to do that for a couple of generations. That will change. And without the power of the American economy and American military, all other powers will have to spend a lot of money on building up their armaments. And some of these authoritarian powers, their commitment to the liberal economic order in the world is very transactional. Right now, it suits them to be part of this order because it brings, to put it bluntly, it puts money in their pockets. But they could change their calculus, especially if they're ruled by individuals like Putin, like Xi Jinping. They could change their minds. This assumption that they will behave themselves because it is in their interest to behave themselves is a very flawed assumption. The idea that countries don't go to war because they are dependent on each other economically is also deeply flawed. Before the First World War, Germany was one of Britain's biggest customers. One of the biggest trade relationships Britain had was actually with Germany. Actually, Winston Churchill, who people like to quote, before the First World War, said that we're never going to get into a war with any country anymore because all of these European countries have this common economic future together. And if something were to happen to Germany, I don't know what we would do about selling our goods and services. That was Winston Churchill before the First World War. Well, the First World War showed that countries, and there have been other examples since then, that countries and governments are capable of going to war despite economic hardship, even when conflicts are directly against their economic interests. And I don't think that just because we've come 100 years from the First World War, that has changed. If you look around, there are many parts of the world still where, and parts of Europe where quite recently conflict broke out between the people for some of the oldest and most basic human reasons at all. Ethnic differences, religious differences, territorial differences. I'm talking about the Balkans, of course. But there, but for the grace of God, go we, and goes the rest of the world. So I submit to you that a world where nobody is in charge is not a world that we should be looking forward to with any kind of eager anticipation. On the contrary, that is a recipe for chaos. Because if nobody is in charge, then nobody takes responsibility for the problems. And we're in an era where our problems are increasingly global problems and require global solutions. They require multilateral solutions. But multilateralism is not the same as multipolarism. They're two quite distinct ideas. And multilateral solutions can and should happen, but they require leadership. Will China provide that leadership? I don't think so. China is not the notion that China can replace the old Soviet Union as a second superpower is also, I think, very deeply flawed. The Soviet Union was a superpower because, for several reasons. One, it had a political idea that it aggressively exported to the world. China doesn't have a political idea like communism to export to the world. It may be ruled by a so-called communist party, but it is not trying to foist its system on anybody else. It's not recommending to other countries in the world that they should follow the Chinese way. China seems quite capable of doing business with countries that are democracies and countries that are dictatorships, and it doesn't seem to care one way or the other. The Soviet Union also was able to provide a security umbrella and economic umbrella for countries that it regarded as its clients. China is doing no such thing. China is not saying to any country in the world, if you follow us, we will, give you economic security, but we will also come to your defense if somebody else were to have designs on your territory. The Soviet Union was also set up against somebody. So the Soviet Union would go to Egypt under Nasser and say, if the Americans are giving you trouble, we can help you, we'll sell you weapons, we'll give you money for the Aswan Dam, we will help your economy, we will give you favorable trade terms, we will buy your cotton, we will sell you our wheat. That's not China. China isn't interested in doing that. The Soviet Union had an enormous military advantage. It was able to project its forces around the world. It had navies in multiple oceans. The Soviet power the basis of Soviet power was that at the end of the Second World War, Soviet armies were spread out in Eastern Europe in particular, and it was able to maintain that position. And this was not just any old army. It was an army that had defeated Nazi Germany and therefore had a great deal of actual credibility as a fighting force. And for various sort of portions of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was able to reach for and achieve a certain parity with the United States in terms of nuclear weapons, in terms of numbers of ships in the ocean, in terms of far more soldiers, of course, in terms of ballistic missiles. That's not China either. China's building up its navy and building up its armed forces. It is the second largest spender on defense. But China has no presence in the Atlantic Ocean. China has almost no presence in the Indian Ocean, certainly nothing in the Mediterranean. Even in the Pacific, it is sort of more or less the Chinese naval presence is restricted to the sort of waters off its own coasts. It does frighten some of its neighbors when China claims larger parts of the ocean for itself, but nobody is under any impression that China is going to be able to launch a major naval battle against anybody anytime soon. China is a world power. Let me not mince my words on this. China is a highly efficient and a very, very impressive world power. What it has achieved in the last 25 years is nothing short of miraculous. It has raised hundreds of millions of people from poverty into a comfortable middle class status. It has raised its own status in world affairs. But it does so by riding on an economic order for which it takes no responsibility itself. China is not there to protect the economic order. China is happy to take the benefit of it. China has aspirations to be a leader in Asia, but even in Asia, there are so many countries that do not accept China's leadership and contest it. And not small countries, but Japan, Korea, India, Vietnam. Unlike the Soviet Union where Russia had overwhelming authority over many countries in Eastern Europe, China does not have that. The only country with which China has a relationship that is similar to, let's say, Russia's relationship with the Soviet Union's relationship with, let's say, Romania, is with North Korea. And that's it. That's the extent of China's ability to influence other countries. So China is quite happy to be seen as a large force. It is happy to spend its money in developing countries as long as it brings advantage to China. But the idea that China can be a second pole to balance out America's interests, I think, is a questionable one. To balance out America's interests, you'd have to imagine a scenario where a country, let's just say hypothetically, Italy, were unhappy with America for some reason, or felt threatened by America economically or militarily by America for some reason, would be able to go to China and say, give us protection from America. I think if that happened, China would say thank you, but no thank you. So that's not China's presence. And China's economic success, to a substantial degree, is part of a demographic dividend. It's part of it being the largest country in the world, the largest population in the world. Historically, China has often, throughout history, been the richest country in the world because it had the largest population. Back at a time before the 19th century, when agriculture was the main source of was the main economic activity around the world, it was a very simple calculation. The country that had the most farmers would be the richest country. China had the most people, therefore it had the most farmers, and therefore it was the richest country in the world. India had the second most people, it had the second most number of farmers, and it was the second richest country in the world. And China may once again, in 2028 or 2025, depending on which economist you believe, may once again have the largest economy in the world, but that doesn't mean China will be the richest country in the world. Because per capita GDP, China is behind Slovakia, never mind being behind the United States. China's per capita GDP now is, I think, 1/4 that of Italy. So it'll be a long way. And just as China has had demographic dividends, there are some demographic time bombs waiting for China. Its population is aging very, very fast. The 30-odd years of a one-child policy is creating distortions in the population that they're going to have to deal with pretty quickly. There's an interesting statistic that came out earlier this year from the United Nations. China's elderly population, people who are retired, is going to go from 10% of its population to 20% of it. So it's going to double in 20 years. That is the fastest rate in human history. No other country, even Japan, didn't go from 10% to 20%. China is going to do that in 20 years. In Japan, it took 23. It took Germany 61 years to go from a point where 10% of its population was elderly to 20% of the. So China is going to have to deal pretty quickly with very, very large numbers of people who are no longer part of the working population. The generation that is following behind them is undermined by the one-child policy. And by 2040, the proportion of Chinese who are, the demographers use something called, it's called the Dependency Index. It is an index of the population that is retired, so 65 and above, versus the population that is in the working age, so between 20 years and 64 years. Right now, there's quite a gap. I'm going to quote the official statistics, so I want to get it right. Right now, that index, it's called a ratio, the dependency ratio. Right now, China is at 14% and the United States is at 24%. So the United States has a much larger proportion of its population that is retired and therefore become dependent on, to some degree, the state and dependent on those who are in the working population. But by 2050, the United States will be 39% and China will be 41%. And at that stage, the Chinese population that will be retired will be 350 million people. That is the size of Europe. That is bigger than the size of the United States. And this is in a state-controlled economy. The state will be responsible for a large chunk of those 350 million people. So all this wealth that China is creating, the Chinese government is creating for itself in its sovereign funds, a lot of that money is going to have to go to looking after those people. There's another very important statistic that you have to look at when you look at China. Right now, barely more than half of China's population live in cities. China is still quite substantially a rural population. Now, as countries develop, as they become more modern and more economically developed, there's a flow of people from the country to to the cities, and most developed countries, the urban population is 80% and more. In the US, it's now 82%. In China, it's like 53, 54%. Now, going forward, a lot of those people will want to go and live in these shining cities that China has built. They will want jobs. And those jobs will have to be protected. If we in the West are worried about robotics, about artificial intelligence taking away our jobs, the threat to an economy like China that depends on manufacturing is much, much greater. And so China has big problems coming down the line, and China has not yet encountered a serious economic crisis. I'm old enough to remember in the 1980s when we thought about Japan in the way that people now think about China. Japan had seemed to be the next big thing. People were seriously talking about the Japanese economy overtaking the American economy. Japan had a primarily state-controlled economy. Japan was producing high-quality goods. It had a greater life expectancy. All the indications were that Japan was going to take over. As you know, it didn't. In fact, instead, it went into, the first time it faced a serious economic crisis, it went into a downward spiral from which it has not really recovered. And now it is struggling with its own demographic problems. It has a very old population and not enough young people coming up through the ranks to fill all these positions. And of course, Japan had one huge problem that China will also face, which is the inability and unwillingness to attract talent from other parts of the world. Very few people go to China to get higher education. Very few people are trying to cross multiple borders to go to China to find jobs. There are language barriers, there are cultural barriers, there are political barriers. Right now, China might feel that it doesn't need more people because it has more than 1.25 billion. But America's great advantage, which the president seems to be working very hard to remove, America's great advantage is that it is a place where anybody can go. The brightest minds, the hardest workers can go to America, be accepted, and begin to contribute to the American economy. So, just as a multipolar order is not the solution to the world's problems, I submit to you that a Chinese superpower, first of all, is unlikely to emerge in the fashion that we think of superpowers, and that even as China rises, its willingness to take on the great problems of the world has not yet been demonstrated. There's no reason to be confident that China will step up when there is a great crisis somewhere in the world to say, we will send soldiers, doctors, aid to solve this problem. I mean, if you remember the Asian tsunami, that took place right in China's backyard. China's role in bringing relief and reconstruction to those countries was not a very significant one. And by the way, many of those countries would not welcome China's presence because of their cultural and political history. So basically, my argument is that America is the only game in town. If you agree with me that the world needs leadership, then American leadership is the only kind of leadership that makes sense. If another country were to emerge that were willing to provide American-style leadership, that is something we can welcome. But that's not happening. Nobody else is stepping up to provide the kind of leadership that the United States has provided historically. Now, the US faces some very, very serious crises in itself. I don't want to understate that. America has a huge debt crisis. It has a climate crisis. But its biggest crisis, I submit to you, is a crisis of confidence. As I said at the beginning, Americans themselves feel that they no longer have a big role to play in the world. That's a serious crisis. But we've been here before. This is not the first time that Americans have felt this about themselves. They felt this about themselves at the end of the 19th century. They felt this way about themselves between the two world wars when the Great Depression struck. They felt this way about themselves in the 1970s and 80s as Japan was rising. They felt this way about themselves at various points in the 90s. Every 10 or 15 years, if you go back to American polling, you will find that 85% of Americans or 90% of Americans feel that things are not going their way, that they have lost their way in the world. I think we've reached another of those points, and I think that we will turn again. And the reason I think that is because America's true power in the world has not, despite reports to the contrary, greatly reduced. Yes, the Chinese economy is growing, but America's contribution to the world economy has not significantly diminished. In 1980, America made up about a quarter of the world economy. Today, America makes up about a quarter of the world economy. China's rise has not come at the expense of America. It has come at the expense of Japan. It's come at the expense of Europe to a large degree, but not at the expense of America. And we're talking about all sectors of the economy. If we narrow our search down to the sectors of the economy that matters most in the future, technology, innovation, science, research, then America's contribution is much bigger than a quarter. It's probably more like half, possibly even more than that, and China's contribution in those areas is very, very small. Russia's is practically non-existent. So the American economy is still a superpower economy. The American military, I don't think I need to say, is very much a superpower military, far and away the largest in the world. The United States spends more, everyone sees the statistic, spends more on its military every year than the next 10, 12 countries put together. If you take away China, then the growth in America's military budget this year is more than what the next 10 countries spend together on their military. And it's not just spending money blindly. A lot of that money goes into cutting edge military spending, the sort of cutting edge technology, where America's advantage is even greater than the sheer force of numbers. America's universities, we're at a university, America's universities are still the best in the world. And because of that, America's advantage in research and science and technology are far, far ahead of any other country or any other group of countries that you can mention. America's companies are still some of the most innovative, the most dominant companies in the world. So, as I said before, the rumors of America's decline or death are greatly exaggerated. Just because Americans are feeling bad for themselves, it doesn't mean they ought to be feeling bad for themselves. They need to solve their own problems. They need to, first of all, snap out of it, get out of this funk that they are finding themselves, get out of this self-doubt. And I think that will happen. That will happen because the economy is already beginning to turn around. It grew to 2.5% last year, which, given the size of the American economy, is a big achievement. This year, it will exceed that amount, and the forecasts for the next 2 or 3 years are sort of around the 3% mark, which is an enormous growth for an economy that size. And historically, when the American economy has grown, when jobs have come back, America has begun to feel more confident about itself, and I believe that will happen again. It'll happen again because America's lead in all these areas that I've mentioned to you will continue. American companies continue to provide cutting-edge technology, cutting-edge science, research, and the big problems that America has are problems that America has the ability to solve. We are going through a period where America seems reluctant to take its leadership role in solving the world's problems. That is a serious crisis, but I believe that too will change. One of my favorite movies of all time starts with a line, the opening line of that film, actually spoken by an Italian immigrant. And I will close today by quoting that line. I won't try to match the accent. But the line goes, "I believe in America." Thank you.